know what Warren said because I was frantically turning the music down. But hey, I'm Megan. I'm sure you know me by now. But I started homebrewing 12 years ago, 2009. I just happened upon it. I was at varsity. I was studying microbiology at the time. And there was a homebrew system on site in the chemistry department. I looked at it and thought, this looks like a challenge. So I took it up. And I was also a student and quite thirsty. So I started homebrewing there. I was limited with ingredients because SAB used to sponsor us, which was awesome. So they'd sponsor us malt, but of course they only have pale malt, crystal malt, and black patent. So when I was looking back at my recipes the other day from those days, I was making all sorts. Oktoberfest, porter, brown ales, alt beers, but all using the same 3 grains. And I thought they were pretty good at the time. They were probably not so great. But at the same time, I would also try and get some ingredients from Joburg. They used to post them down. Back then, the courier was too expensive. So the postal office, I think, thought that hops was weed. So I used to have to sit and pick hops out of the grain before I started brewing. So yes, the bug bit. I was up for the challenge. And what was it? 5 years later, came across, well, I'd already come across Dion by that point, but Dion, myself, and Travis joined forces and we went commercial. And so we really just glorified homebrewers. My background is microbiology, yes. So I've got an advantage when it comes to microbes, to yeast and yeast handling. But you'll find throughout this talk, none of it requires a lab. I don't have a lab at home. I could set up a lab. I don't have one. I don't have one downstairs either. And as a commercial brewer, I still don't have a lab. So the whole point of this talk is to tell you you can actually do your own yeast handling at home in your own kitchen if you've got the right little odds and ends. And the big thing for me is yeast is often an afterthought. So you're all so frantic about getting your grain and your recipe and everything, your water profile if you're that way inclined, and you're good to go on your day, you're getting your strike water up, and you do your brew day, super exciting. End of brew day comes, you're tired, now it's the cleaning step, and the yeast. It's the last minute, last kind of, and it actually should be your first. You could make a lot of mistakes during your brew day that will be fixed by pitching correctly, pitching enough yeast, enough happy yeast. So yeah, I think let's get going. My title is Happy Yeast, Happy Beer. So really, if your yeast is healthy and happy, you're going to get a healthy, happy beer, good tasting, clean, well-rounded beer. Okay, I'm sure you all know this. It's a single-celled fungus. Just the basics. Remember, there's 2 main types of yeast. There's an ale yeast and a lager yeast. Ale yeast is Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It is top fermenting, so it tends to have quite a large krausen, so lots of froth at the top. And something that you might not know, the reason for this, it's not just because the yeast likes to hang out there. It's the surface of the yeast cell on an ale yeast is actually hydrophobic, so the CO2 bubbles tend to stick to the cells. And as a result, the CO2 sticks and the cells rise up to the top and they tend to hang out there. It doesn't mean that the yeast stays up there. It still cycles down, collects more CO2 bubbles, rises back up to the top. Generally fermented between 18 and 21 degrees Celsius. And then, of course, there's the lager yeast, which is a different species name. It's Pastorianus. Now it's bottom fermenting, so it's got a different cell wall structure, so the CO2 bubbles don't stick, and it tends to sit closer down to the bottom of the fermenter. It still churns, though. It's still around. It's still in your fermenter. It's a much slower fermentation, mostly because of the temperature that it ferments at, and it has a lower flocculation ability. And because of this, because it flocculates or settles down slower, it stays in suspension for longer, and as a result has got more contact time with the beer, thereby cleaning up the beer. So you'll find that it's a much cleaner profile. So your ales tend to have more fruity esters, more complex characters, while your lagers are very clean, very crisp, very little on the aromatic side in terms of the yeast anyway. And as you can see, ferments between 11 and 12 degrees. But how do you decide what yeast you want to choose? Ultimately, you've got to think about what you want from the beer. Do you want something that's a little bit more spicy? So you would think maybe a Saison yeast or maybe a Hefeweiss. Do you want something more fruity, more clean? Or do you want kind of more of a dual purpose like a Kolsch yeast? So companies, thank goodness we've got companies like Liquid Culture. They're a local yeast manufacturing company, which is awesome. So they've got so many strains of yeast, and you can go onto their website. So do yourselves a favor and go and check out what they've got on their site. And they go into fantastic detail about what exactly the yeast will produce during fermentation. And if it doesn't answer your questions, you can actually message Errol and Christopher, and they'd be eager to help. They can help you in terms of, if I ferment at this temperature, is it going to give me more phenols or more esters? Or what is its flocculation ability or its attenuation? They've done thorough tests with all of those yeasts, and they know them inside out. So if you ever have any worries about what yeast you want to use, for example, if you want, this is the recipe you want something that's got apple and lychees and to come from the yeast, get hold of them, and they've probably got a strain that'll do exactly that for you. But it's quite fun. There's so many different strains of yeast to play with that where do you start, where do you stop? I love including this. Dion laughed at me yesterday when I went through it because I include it in anything. I'm sure if I do a presentation on how to build a car, I'll sneak that in too. So this is a scanning electron micrograph of yeast cells. So super, super detailed. In fact, that first image I showed you there, so that's what you'd see under a standard microscope, a lab microscope. And then, yes, the scanning electron shows you so much more detail. So that's a little budding cell there. And these little spots there, those are actually bud scars. So these, you can see these cells here have worked pretty hard. So yes, yeast is a very, very broad topic. And I don't want to keep you here all night. There's curfews and there's drinking to be done. So let's cover just starters and also reusing yeast. I've just looking at what's chatted about on Facebook and the homebrewers group, there's a lot of talk about starters and reusing, and it's really not that difficult. And honestly, even when I started my own starters and reusing yeasts in the early days, I was scared. I thought, even as a microbiologist with a fully kitted out lab, I still waited a good couple of years before I started doing it because I thought that this was beyond me. And it's really not, and it's something that anyone can do. As I say, you can do it on your kitchen counter. So, what is a yeast starter? Basically, a yeast starter, you're taking a culture, so whether it's a single cell off of a plate or a slant, or a bottle of yeast, so a nice chunky bottle of yeast. So it can be any volume. You're going to add nutrients and wort to it, and you're basically scaling it up. So you're taking a set amount of yeast and you're basically reproducing it. So you've got a higher cell count. That's what a starter is. So we'll cover some basics of that. So why are you going to do a starter? As I said in the beginning, happy yeast is a happy beer. The one thing, I mean, we all know yeast is a living organism, but we forget that it's the same as us. You throw us into cold or too hot environments, we're going to be unhappy. If you starve us of oxygen, you starve us of food, we're going to be unhappy as well. In fact, we're probably going to get sick, and we wouldn't last very long. And yeast is exactly the same. You put them into a very harsh environment, whether it's too hot or too cold, or nutrient-depleted environments, it's not going to be happy. And as a result, it's going to produce byproducts, which is then going to produce off characteristics in your beer. So perhaps too much of the phenols, acetaldehyde, things like that. So what are the benefits? It means that when you do pitch into your fermenter, you've done your brew day, you've pitched, it means now your yeast is rearing to go. So when you've done your starter, and I'll do a little demo just now, but when you've done your starter, you've added fresh wort that's full of nutrients, and you've basically woken the yeast up. The yeast is now acclimatized to the sugary environment, because the sugary environment is actually quite harsh. It's very high in terms of osmotic potential. It is actually a harsh environment for that yeast. So by doing a starter, you're basically preparing the yeast for the wort in your fermenter. So you'll find that your fermentation is going to be a lot more successful. It's going to be faster, and you'll find your beer is drinkable sooner as well. So when I first started home brewing, I found my beers were nicest after maybe a month, because they kind of had a green apple characteristic after about 2 weeks. You kind of needed to forget about them for a month and then crack them open. But I found ever since I started doing the starters, they clean up so much faster. So now really the only thing you're waiting for is to have them carbonate. And then they're drinkable from the get-go. And that's always a positive. It saves money, sorry for the home brewer stores, but doing starters also means that you can then, instead of buying 2 sachets, you can just buy 1, do a starter, and pitch it into a double-sized batch. So it saves money. And you can also learn about how the strains are behaving. So like its flocculation ability or kind of esters, phenols that it might produce, attenuation. I know I've been playing with Oslo, the Kveik Oslo yeast, and it's always fascinating to see it in a flask because I'll put it on a stirrer and you'll see all the clumps. In fact, there's a picture later on that is very reminiscent of what Oslo looks like. And then I think that it's done. So I'll turn off the stir plate. It settles beautifully, forms a beautiful yeast layer at the bottom, and the spent wort or apparent spent wort at the top is beautifully clear. And I think, okay, well, it must be done. And you look closer, and it's like a little bottle of Coke. It's just a glass of Coke. It's just fizzing like crazy. So the yeast is just flocculated out, but it's still eating those sugars. So it's worth knowing that when you put it into your fermenter, if your beer is clear, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's done. So that's always those little hints and tricks from doing a starter you can actually learn before you even do your brew day. Also, like things like sulfur. I mean, I think the first time I did a lager, you know how lagers can produce sulfur. It's like somebody farted. And I smelled my fermenter and thought something's really wrong here. And I see it often on posts with new homebrewers. They're like, something's really not right. It smells like fart. And it's not. It's just what a yeast does. A lager yeast does at the end of fermentation. It's good. It's just venting. So when are you going to do a starter? For me, it's routine. There's very seldom times that I don't do a starter, even if it's what I'm going to show you just now, where it's rehydrate, add a little bit of wort, and even that morning of brew day, just to kind of wake it up, get it ready to go. I will always do a starter. At the very least, I will rehydrate my yeast. The beauty also of doing a starter, and I'm sure I'm going to cover it just now, but when you pitch into your fermenter, you can actually leave a teeny bit behind in whatever flask or jar you're using, put more wort onto that, and just keep growing it. Use it for the next batch. And then you've saved yourself even more yeast or money. If you are doing a high gravity brew, so Baltic porters or whatever, anything above 1060, 1.060, you would want to do a starter. It's quite a taxing environment for yeast, so you want to pitch a lot higher, and you want to make sure that the yeast is rearing to go to deal with that amount of sugars. Of course, if you're doing an increased volume or increased batch size, you also want to do a starter. And also lagers. So if you are doing a lager, the general rule of thumb is you want to do a double than you would normally an ale. So normally an 11.5 gram sachet would go into a 20-liter batch of an ale. You would actually want double that for a lager. And that's mainly because it's such a slow fermenter and because of those cool temperatures. It needs a head start. And of course, unless you're buying yeast that's manufactured locally, we have no idea what yeast we are getting. It could be sitting in a container in the middle of summer in Durban for days, weeks, months, for all we know. It just arrives, and yes, it's got an expiry date on, but that doesn't mean anything. It's traveled really far, especially foreign brands like White Labs or Fermentus. They're not locally made, so there's no way of knowing how they're going to behave. So by doing a starter, at least you'll see a little bit of activity, and then you know that that yeast is actually viable and you can use it. If you don't see any activity, then it's probably going to be dead. Cool. If you have any questions about anything that I'm talking about, please just shout. What are the consequences of underpitching? So your lag phase is going to be extended. So remember, the lag phase is the initial phase of fermentation. So you don't see any activity. So lag phase is from the moment you pitch your yeast to the signs of activity, bubbling and krausen formation. So the lag phase is basically when the yeast is acclimatizing to this pretty harsh environment. So it's getting used to the sugar and high sugar environment. It's using quite a lot of the nutrients and amino acids that are in the wort to create more biomass. Because of course, the little sachet or the tiny amount of yeast that you pitch it's not enough to deal with that amount of sugar in the wort. So it needs to duplicate or replicate enough to get through that 20 liters or 100 liters or 20,000 liters and complete fermentation. So lag phase is usually 6 hours to 12 hours or 24 hours. So you'll find that if you've underpitched, you'll get onto day 2 and it's still not showing any activity. And as a result, infection could sneak in by that point. So you don't want anything in there to take hold before the yeast does. And I have to be honest, I don't think any of us brew a wort that's sterile. If you put it in a closed container and left it, it's going to grow something. There's always something that is living at some point, and there's microorganisms that survive the boiling process. So you want to get that yeast going as soon as possible to eat all of that oxygen, because a lot of the spoilage organisms that sour our beer actually need oxygen. So the faster that yeast eats that oxygen and replicates, the less of a chance that those souring bacteria or wild yeasts are going to take hold. So, yeah. Of course, there's yeast stress, flavors and aromas. So if you are underpitching and this poor yeast is now having to get through this fermenter of a lot of sugar, it's going to be unhappy. It's going to produce phenols. It's going to produce some byproducts that you don't want. And that's something that you'll start picking up the more you brew as well. And then incomplete fermentation, so you'll find that it just stops. So you start at 50 points and it just stops at 20, and you don't know why. Gentle rocking doesn't help, and it's just now gone flat. And it's maybe because you've underpitched and the yeast has just got tired. It just had too much work to do, and it's just called it a day. And in those cases, you'd have to repitch. Trying to revive a yeast that's called it quits is going to be hard. So scaling up, and there was a couple of questions on the group a few weeks or days ago about scaling up. And you can literally scale from a single cell on a plate to batch sizes, 1,000-liter batches. So what you would normally do so Christopher at Liquid Culture would normally store his yeast either in a -80 freezer or in liquid nitrogen. I think that's -120. Then he would streak it out onto a plate, make sure that it's a pure culture, and then he would start scaling it up. And he's got these giant batch processes that aerate and keep constant nutrition going. And then that's what he will then distribute out either to home brewers or large-scale commercial brewers. So yes, they can maintain their strains. Because they're kept at those cold temperatures, there's no genetic shift. At -80 or -120, the yeast it's not active, so it's not going to be changing over time. If they were growing up from liquid culture constantly, you'd find that there would be a shift in genetics, and it's natural. It occurs naturally. So you'll find that there'll be a change in flocculation, for example, or perhaps if it's a Hefeweiss yeast, you'll find maybe the banana characteristics will change or disappear completely. It happens naturally, so that's why it's important to make sure you've got your stock cultures kept super cold. All right, so now it's show and tell. So I'm just going to show you how simple it is. I hope I don't mess it up. Literally, you can do this on your kitchen counter. I do. All you need, as the picture shows, I'm growing that and use it for the next batch. When I talk about genetic shift, it happens over time, and as a home brew, it's not something you really need to be concerned about. It's something that the yeast providers, like liquid culture, need to be concerned about. They need to maintain those yeast stocks so that they are the same. But for us as home brewers, keeping our yeast growing, and if it changes slightly in flocculation ability, that's okay. So yes, a flask. To sterilize it, so this is borosilicates, so you can boil it on the stove. This one doesn't have a stir bar in it, but you can put a stir bar in it. It's not going to melt or anything. Put some water in it, put your cotton wool bung, your tinfoil over the top, and I just boil it on the stove. 15 minutes. Sometimes I forget about it. And then I leave it, then I let it cool. Now, you can, if you want to, do it with wort. Just be careful, because if you're boiling wort, it's going to get more concentrate. So if you're boiling it for 15 minutes, it's going to be more sugary than it started. Well, there's that. Wort behaves a lot differently in a flask when it's boiling than water does. It does tend to climb out. So you've got to keep a very beady eye on it. So you can do both options. I just like water because it's cleaner. And what I tend to do, and you can do it if you're doing with a boiling wort as well, there's something called tyndalization, and it sounds fancier than it is. Tyndalization is boiling on one day, letting it cool. The next day, you boil it again, also for about 15 minutes. Now, tyndalization, what happens is, because it's got hot and then it's cooled down, any spore formers that are so spore formers are heat-tolerant microorganisms, so they can survive the boiling process. So by boiling it, cooling it, the spore formers now will get into their vegetative state. I know it sounds a bit crazy, but basically they change into a form that's more affected by heat, so that when you boil it a second time, you'll nail them. So I'll always do a second boil, sometimes even 3, just to be sure. And do the same if you're boiling your wort. So I've invested in a pressure cooker. Did I see a hand?
Sorry,
yeah. Yes.
What water is it?
Just tap water.
Tap water.
Yeah. So if you want to, the boiling will get rid of the chlorine. Chloramine will be around, because chloramine doesn't boil off. I don't know if you know about chloramine. Maybe it's just a bit of a sidetrack, because it really sucks when beer has got chlorophenols in it, and it's almost entirely because of the water that you've used. So now I'm digressing completely, but I suggest, no, it's cool. No, it's cool, because I learned the hard way. I had to dump 1,400 liters of beer, and I didn't know, because our municipality had changed how they were dosing the water. So they were putting chlorine in, as they always do, and chlorine is very volatile. So when you heat up your HLT water, your strike water, all that chlorine goes. But then they also add in chloramine, and chloramine is meant to stay in solution, which means that during traveling between suburbs, by the end point, it's still safe to drink, just in case there's any kind of soil contamination or whatever. So that's why they add in chloramine. But it means, as a brewer, chloramine is still there when we are brewing with it. And chloramine reacts really badly with yeast and hops, and produces chlorophenols, which is that medicinal, it's horrendous. And when you know what it tastes like, you actually can't get around it anymore. So in order to deal with that, you either put in a carbon filter or some kind of a water filter, or you can treat your water with potassium metabisulfite. Super cheap. If you want some, I can give you some downstairs. I've got I think it's a kilo bag. And I literally use 10 grams for 1,200 liters. So if you want some, please just come and I'll give you some. It's fine. I'll give you a pinch each. And that just sediments out. It's not going to affect. All it's going to do is increase your sulfate levels in your beer, and that's not a bad thing. So I always treat my water regardless. I don't want to take that chance anymore. So yes, if you want to treat your flask water as well, you can. But I haven't had an issue with the yeast dealing with the chloramines. Okay. And then also, so this is just wort. I saved it from a previous brew. There was wort in the pipe, so I just saved it. But I have a pressure cooker at home. For you guys as home brewers, you don't need to have a pressure cooker. You can literally do the boiling on the stove like I discussed. Do the tinderization, boil it the second time. I just have a pressure cooker because I need to be sure that the yeast that I'm growing is not contaminated because of the commercial side. You don't need a fancy Bunsen burner. A camping burner is perfect, does the trick. And just in case I do mess it up, I'm just using Cooper's yeast. Okay, let's do this. And you're starting, just to cover this, you're starting DME, or your starting wort, this guy, needs to be 40 points, 1.040. So normally that's 100 grams of DME to a liter of water, or 200 grams of DME to 2 liters. That generally will give you your 40 points. I sometimes add a little bit of hops. You don't have to. The hops, as you know, are antimicrobial, so just make sure that nothing else is going to sneak in. And you can use a little bit of yeast nutrient as well. And agitation. So I've built a couple of stir plates. There's so many YouTube videos on how to build a stir plate. It is not absolutely necessary. Every time you walk past to make a cup of tea, give it a swirl. Go back, give it another swirl. That has also proven very effective to just give it odd agitation, just to release those CO2 bubbles. The main thing is to just get the CO2 off the yeast cells so it doesn't become too toxic. Okay, let's not mess this up. For sanitizer, when I'm doing this, I actually buy isopropanol. So it's ethanol, but it's the one that you can't drink. I buy it from True Chem. So I'm sure they do it in smaller containers, but they do about 25 liters as well. So if you guys ever want actual ethanol for like full-on sanitizing, it's for surfaces, not ever in contact with your beer, because you'll probably smell it when I start spraying it. It's terrible, and it is toxic. They make isopropanol, or there's another one. In fact, this is the one it is. They put a 5% acetone in it to stop you drinking it, and you'll smell it now. And it works so well. So for me, I spray it when I'm cleaning ball valves before I take a sample, or for this to spray in the cotton wool, that kind of thing. And this is a lot more potent than sanitizer, because remember, sanitizer needs at least a minute, I think, or 2 minutes of contact time before you can trust that it's sanitized. This is 5 seconds or so, and then you can rely on it being sanitary. Cool. I hope you can all see. So what I'm going to do, this step that I'm going to show you now is basically just the rehydration step. So whether it's a fermenter sachet or whatever, I'm going to rehydrate it, and then I'm going to add the wort over the top. But just because we're short of time, I'm going to put it in and just add the wort same time. Normally, you'd add the dehydrated yeast into the sterile water, seal it up, and then you just leave it. Don't shake it. Don't do nothing. Just let the yeast sit on the surface of the water, and you'll find it slowly sinks down, and it figures itself out. You don't want to start agitating, because it just adds a level of stress that the yeast is not quite ready for. Let it do its thing. But I'm going to skip.
So that the cells can get their strength back, the salt.
So the yeast, the dehydrated yeast, is covered in a yeast nutrient. So that when that goes into suspension, it then activates the yeast to just kind of wake up, pretty much. And I don't like to rush that. I rather just let it happen gently. And I think also the forced aeration probably adds a level of stress. I mean, that's my theory anyway. Okay. Yes.
When you look at fermenters, they always say when you rehydrate the yeast, it's got to be, the water is actually going to be a certain temperature. Do you find that it needs to be or not?
No. I think that if it was 25 degrees or whatever they say it needs to be, it's 35. Jeez. Yeah, but I'm too scared. I don't want to kill the yeast.
Just for the purpose of YouTube, can you just repeat the question?
Okay, so the question was, when you are rehydrating your yeast, what temperature does it need to be? Do you follow the directions on the sachet, whether it's 35, as Ryan was saying? 35 is very warm. I would, unless I had a very accurate thermometer, I'd be very concerned about killing the yeast. So I use room temperature, and it might rehydrate slower, but that's okay. I've not.
The scary thing is if you look at some
most yeasts are active and happy at like 22 to 28, but they
Yes.
tell you to rehydrate at 35.
Yes.
That margin of over temperatures is so minute.
Yeah, for sure. So I think the warm, as I say, it probably speeds up the process of the rehydration, but the actual fermentation, if you fermented at 35, you'd create quite a lot of the phenols and esters that you wouldn't want. So I think it's purely for the rehydration step.
Okay, got a question from Anthony.
Yes.
Sarah mentioned in places, but how practical or desirable is it to mix yeast to attain different flavors?
So I actually did do an experiment where I mixed 2 strains of yeast, because the one yeast I really liked the characteristics of, but it didn't flocculate out very well. So I mixed it with an English ale yeast that flocculates out beautifully. And the beer came out well, and it flocculated out well. It was beautifully clear, and yeah, it's worth repeating. The problem with that is that you can't reuse the yeast, because now it's a mixed strain. But yes, there are people that do mix their strains and get different characteristics. So with the Kwijk that produces more of a citrus character, you could co-pitch that. You just have to be careful because the yeasts all have different different fermentation temperatures. They're going to need to have the same range of temperature. You can't co-pitch a lager and an ale yeast because one of them is going to be very unhappy.
Are there beers in the market that do that we know of?
As far as I know, I don't know if breweries would openly say that because it might be a trade secret, but the only beers that I would say are multi-organism are sour beers. So those would have the lactobacillus and the yeast and potentially pediococcus and Brettanomyces. So those are all co-pitch. But those, they ferment at different times. So at varying levels of fermentation, they get activated pretty much at varying levels of pH and sugar levels and that sort of thing. So it's worth experimenting with. I don't see why not. It's just, as I say, reusing yeasts is going to be a problem because you'll find that one of those yeasts might outcompete the other one as well. So you might have, if you reuse, you might have 70% of the one yeast and only 30% of the other. There's no way of knowing. Yeah. Cool. Let's do this. So what I normally do is you'll see it. I'm going to try not talk because talking is just going to introduce microorganisms into the flasks and stuff. But I tend to flame the neck of whatever it is that I'm dealing with. So I'll flame the neck of this flask. So what that does is it sterilizes the neck. Obviously, it's going to kill everything on the neck, but also it will create heat, which will cause an updraft, and so nothing's going to fall in. So you've got to remember there's wildlings all around us. There are wild yeasts like crazy. I mean, I'm sure we've all tried harvesting our own yeast outside, and there's all sorts of stuff that's just going to fall in and contaminate. Especially in a brew house, our malt is covered in lactobacillus. I mean, the quick sour beer uses grain. You just dump the grain into the kettle, and that produces a sour beer. So yes, you've got to always be aware of things floating around. Okay, so I'm talking about it, but I'm not actually doing it. So, oopsie. Say again? Yeah. Okay, so I've sprayed the yeast sachet. I'm going to spray the scissors as well. Oh no, this is nothing fancy. I was so worried I was going to mess it up that I just chose Cooper's yeast, and I think it's from about, I don't know.
2001.
Yes. It might even be, maybe. I'm pretty sure it's not going to have any activity. Okay.
I just made a lager with it.
Serious?
7-year-old. Over.
All right. Okay. So I flame the neck of the flask. Okay, so I've caught myself a lot. Okay, gently pour it in. Okay, so now normally I'd flame the neck gently and I'd put this back on, but just for our uses now, This is my 40-point wort. I'm going to flame the top. Okay. Flame the top again. And then I always spray the cotton wool bung, pop it in. Now literally, that's it. Now you can leave that for 6 hours and it'll probably get through the sugar pretty quickly with some gentle agitation. Or you can let it eat those sugars and add more wort onto the top of that. And what you can do is then stop stirring it once it's finished eating the sugars, let the yeast settle to the bottom, get the flame going again, flame the top, pour off that spent wort at the top into a separate jug that you'll throw away, and add more wort onto that. And you can literally just keep going until you've got enough yeast. And that's what I do for my commercial batches. I literally start, for 450 liters, I start with an 11.5 gram sachet. The yeast producers hate me because I'm such a cheapskate. But you can. So you can save so much money. And I'm going to go into the reusing yeast on your fermenters as well. Okay, so that's him sorted.
I have a question.
Yes.
Can you just use a bung and airlock as well?
Exactly. Well, actually, no. You will still get some growth. What I would do with a bung and an airlock is stuff the airlock with cotton wool and maybe put a bit of tin foil over the top. Because you actually do want some diffusion of air. Because you're going to have more yeast reproducing in an aerobic environment. As soon as it's anaerobic, it actually doesn't really reproduce very much. And the whole point of this is to get the reproduction. You want more cells. So yes, a bung and an airlock is perfect, but just put a little bit of a filter, or even just, yeah, I would put a cotton wool filter and some tin foil to just stop the michies getting in. And yeah, that'll work perfect. Yeah.
So something that I do is I get that fish tank filter stuff, and then I dip it in, I'll actually soak it in the sanitizer, and then I squeeze it out and then I put it in, and then I know even anything that's climbing in is going to touch.
Yes, yes, yeah, good idea.
Because
Yeah.
it's rinse-free, it's not going to poison
Yeah,
anything inside
yeah,
the jar.
it's a good idea. All right. So why not? Why do you not want to do a starter? Yes, there is an increased risk because now you're adding an extra step. So instead of just going with the sachet, now you've got an extra step or maybe a few steps that could add an issue. So if you were perhaps pitching wort that maybe was not sterile, then you might be introducing microbes. So if you're not confident in your wort, then perhaps don't do a starter. But honestly, the risk involved with adding an 11.5 gram sachet into a batch and not really knowing whether it's active or not, or how old it is, or how it's traveled and things like that, there's as much risk in my personal view. So I would always say do a starter. Yes, it takes time. It does. Although this was super quick. The actual process is quick. It's just the preparation. So, and it's something you've got to think about before your brew day, because you can't think about it on your brew day, because by that point it's too late. I know some brewers with success they've taken a portion from their boil. So it's been boiling for say half an hour. They've taken a portion into a peanut butter jar, sealed it. So now that because it's boiling and it's in a sealed jar, it's now self kind of sterilizing. Then they cool that down, and then they put their 11.5 gram sachet into that. Just loosen the lid a little bit because it is going to probably produce some CO2. And then that's now basically your mini starter. So that works as well. For me, the paranoia is real, and I think maybe, well, no, it's not because I'm a commercial brewer, I'm just ridiculous. I always like my pressure cooker. I like the tinderization process where it's 2 days of boiling. But as I say, I've seen so many home brewers do that with success, and I'm sure a few of you have done it as well. So if it's working, don't change it. What's the alternatives? Oh yeah, of course. yes, you need glassware, but you don't really. I mean, you could just use a multitude of peanut butter jars. We all eat peanut butter and gherkins. So you don't need to invest in the fancy stuff, and you don't need fancy stir plates or anything like that. Every little bit that you do will help your ultimate beer, really. So what are your alternatives? Is, yes, you can reuse, and I'll go into a little bit more detail now. You can wash your yeast. So if you're going to reuse from your fermenter, you can do a washing step. Either you can wash it, do the acid washing, or you can just wash it with sanitized or sterile water and then split it up. There are risks with that because you're putting the yeast under quite a lot of stress because it's water, and again, the osmotic potential that's from the water and the yeast cells, it does stress the yeast. So if you're going to do your yeast washing, there is nothing wrong. I've never washed yeast. I've never felt I needed to do it. A lot of brewers, a lot of home brewers, a lot of commercial brewers do it with success. But the one thing is you cannot just pitch it straight into your batch. Perhaps it's worked for you to just pitch it straight in, and that's cool. But I would always recommend you do a starter first. So even just a little one with a little bit of sugar just to reactivate that yeast. Yes?
Our friend Doug Berry is in the house.
Hey, Doug.
So how's it, Doug?
Hey.
Can you ask her how challenging is it to stress the yeast to get particular flavors? So to actually stress it to get a flavor?
Well, my theory with like a Hefeweiss is it? Okay. So my theory, I haven't actually found any specific literature, but the banana and phenols, for me, that's a stressed flavor. Because if we put our lager or ale yeasts at 35 or 40, we would get, maybe not the banana, but we'd get the phenols. So I think that is actually kind of a stressed flavor. But it is a positive in a Hefeweiss. So yes, there's in fact, and I'm not dissing them because it works beautifully. I love milk stout, Castle milk stout. That is not an ale, it's a lager. SAB would never produce 2 strains of yeast. They use a lager yeast. What they do with much success is they ferment Castle milk stout slightly warmer. I don't know what temperature they ferment at, but they're fermenting slightly warmer to force the yeast to produce diacetyl. The good diacetyl, the butterscotch diacetyl, that gives you that sweetness. So yes, that's an example of forcing the yeast to produce an off flavor, but actually to your benefit. And it works really well.
And it's the best beer to make.
That it is. Cool. And yes, alternatively, you can just buy more yeast. Yeast is expensive. Okay, so reusing. I think I discussed it briefly on the group the other day, but when you finished bottling, I mean, provided your bottling has been, things have flown in and stuff, and cling film dunked in sanitizer is fantastic. So if you've put your bottling wand or your autosiphon or whatever into your fermenter, like in your bucket or whatever, just dump some cling film and some sanitizer. It sounds weird, but now it's no longer sticky. And then you can wrap any opening of your fermenter so that nothing's going to fly in. And then you can, with confidence, when you've finished bottling, take the autosiphon out, give it a fat swirl, and then you can decant it into sterile jars. So to sanitize jars, if you don't have a pressure cooker, is you just boil them in a pot. So you take all the lids off, you submerge all of the jars in a giant pot of boiling water, and you just boil them. I think half an hour is probably enough. And that should be enough to make sure that they're sanitary. And then, yes, you can just pour the yeast directly into those jars, seal them up nicely, and if you are brewing in the next week or so, I would keep one of those jars out of the fridge. If you are brewing now down the line, I would keep them in the fridge, but I would always do like a mini starter to just wake them up again, because being in the fridge is a pretty stressful environment. I've got a lager yeast. It's just W3470, nothing fancy. And I'll put it in the fridge because I always reuse. And I put it in the fridge, take it out, let it get to room temperature. I pitch it into an Erlenmeyer like this with some fresh wort, and I just leave it. I don't put it on a stir plate or anything. I just let it do its thing for a couple of days. It takes 2 full days for me to see any activity. So if I put that yeast into a brew, it would have probably taken even longer, because remember, your brew has got so much more sugar, so much more volume, that the yeast is actually going to be pretty stressed out. So if you're going to store yeast in the fridge, always do just a mini starter, like literally 500 mils, 250 mils of some wort, to just kind of remind the yeast of it. So an add to this slide is I would suggest trying to do a wort stability test. I don't know if you've ever heard of a wort stability. So what you do is you follow your standard protocol. You haven't added your yeast yet. You get a sterile jar, so something that you've boiled in a pot for half an hour or whatever. You pour a little bit of that wort into the jar. You don't see any growth within 48 hours, you're good. Your sanitation is spot on. You can happily reuse that yeast from your fermenter. If you're seeing growth within that 48 hours, so bubbling, pellicle on the top, crowls and something funky, I would be a little bit more concerned about reusing that yeast, because it means there's something in your process, whether it's in your fermenter, your transfer lines, maybe you didn't boil for long enough or whatever, there's not right, and that will ultimately be growing in your yeast. It doesn't mean that your batch is going to be off. Your batch is probably going to be perfect and the beer will taste amazing, because the yeast has outcompeted whatever that contaminant is. But then you use it again, that contaminant's going to be like, ooh, let's grow a little bit more. Use it again, grows more, and then you start getting sour beers coming up. So yes, it's worth trying a wort stability test, even if it's just once, to just check your process. And you might surprise yourself. The first time I did a wort stability test, we laughed about it. It sat on my fridge for about a month and it didn't grow anything. It shows you how ridiculous I am.
My first wort stability test made it to a day and a half before it got hazy. So I'm a little bit jealous.
But it's why I'm a microbiologist. I have a degree in cleaning, basically. Okay, so when do you not want to reuse? I hope I'm not cutting into your drinking time. When do you not want to reuse? So if you found that your fermentation was slow, or it was a bit stuck, or it kind of got off slowly, started bubbling only after maybe 2 days or 3 days, I wouldn't reuse, because now that's given any kind of contaminant that might have been there a window period to start growing. If your yeast is stressed, so if you're doing a high gravity brew, so anything over, personally, anything above 55, 60 points, so 1060, I wouldn't reuse. They always say anything below 50 points, you can reuse that yeast happily. Those high gravity brews are actually a very stressful environment for yeast. And yes, the brew can go through successfully, but it is still stressful. And remember, because of that high gravity, you do still need to pitch much, much higher because of that environment. So bear that in mind. If you've overused the yeast, so if you've kind of had multiple batches on the yeast, it will start getting tired, because remember those little bud scars, that picture that I love so much, those bud scars, if you think about yourselves, if you're full of scars and scratches, we're not going to function very well. It's sore, you don't move so well, it impacts on our daily living. And it's the same for yeast. If it's full of bud scars, it's going to just not want to anymore. So overused yeast is going to be tired, and you don't want to reuse too many times. So I get the question a lot, how many times can I reuse? So there's breweries that have been reusing for hundreds of years, but they've got very strict laboratories where they make sure that what they're selecting for is the correct one, and they always make sure that it's flocculating the same way, all of that. I reuse twice. I don't want to take any risks with reusing and introducing any infection. As a homebrewer, you can also reuse many times. Remember, if you are reusing from your fermenter, you can swirl that bottom of the fermenter and you can split it into maybe 5 jars, and that's probably enough for 5 brews. So ultimately, do you need to reuse 10 times? I don't know. I guess it's a personal choice. I've found if I reuse too much, I find the flocculation ability it reduces. So I find the beer becomes hazier and hazier and hazier, and I'm needing to cold crash for longer. So if you find that suddenly one of your yeast strains is just not making a clear beer, perhaps you've just reused it too many times and you might need to go back. If you've got a strain at home that you've been using for a very long time, kind of your house strain, I know liquid culture, I'm punting them hard, but I'm not getting any payback for them, I promise. But they actually do some storage for you. So if you found a cool yeast from, a orange blossom or whatever, they can store that yeast for you. Then nobody else is allowed to touch it. And then they can store it at -80. In fact, I think that they store it for free. And you just pay for the regrowth, which is really awesome. So if you've ever got a strain that you really love and you want stored so there's no genetic shift, chat to them. I'm sure they'll be happy to help. And yes, if there's any sign of contamination. So you remember when I spoke about when you're doing your starters, and if you're wanting to keep it growing, you let the yeast settle down to the bottom, and then there's going to be a clear layer at the top of the spent wort. You can pour that off, and then you can put fresh wort onto the top of that. I always taste that stuff that I've poured off into a jug. Always taste it. Smell it as well. It is going to taste like starter because it's very much fermented out. It's not going to taste like a beer, but you'll start to pick up what it's supposed to taste like. It's like it has a sharpness because it's eaten all of those sugars, but it's not a sourness. And it's really good to know what the starter or spent starters taste like so that you know that things are actually going right and there's nothing funky going on. And also smell it. So anytime I do any growth, I'll always taste and smell that spent starter just to make sure everything's okay. Oh, and also a good habit to get into is take a couple of, so after bottling day, take a 6-pack or a 2-pack or whatever, put it in a warm corner, somewhere. Underpitching is a lot more detrimental to your beer than overpitching. Follow what's recommended on the sachets as well. To be honest, I've always used slightly more than the 11.5 gram sachets to the 20 liters, just because I know that it's traveled and it's probably had a hard life to begin with. So this was just screenshots from Beersmith. So you can choose whether it's an ale or a cider. If I had chosen lager there, here. If I had chosen lager there, it would have given me two sachets. I would have needed 2 sachets. But being an ale at warm temperatures, I only needed the 1 sachet. But yes, like there, slurry, I chose slurry. There's just dry sachet. So you can plug in all the numbers. This is how much slurry you would need. So it's just kind of a guide. If you're over that, as I say, you're maybe over pitching slightly, but it's not going to be a negative. It's if you're under that, that's going to be a problem. And you might be risking yeast stress or contamination. Yeah, I covered that. But your experience, honestly, I think you've all been brewing for a long time now. You know what works. You know what produces a good beer. You'll start learning what level of slurry you need to create a good beer. You'll see how active the fermentation is, how good the beer tastes afterwards. You can measure it. It does require a microscope. Alternatively, you can also just get some standard glassware, same old peanut butter jars, and just mark out on those jars, maybe with one of those etching things, where 100 mils is or whatever. So then you know how much yeast you're going to need for a 30-liter batch or whatever. Cool. Yeah, honestly, don't be scared. As I said, I was scared, and I was a microbiologist with full access to a lab, and I've never looked back. Since I took the plunge, I've never looked back. And if you have any questions, if you have any worries, you've got my number. You can just shout and give it a go. And if it doesn't work the first time, well, you can go back to your old waste. But just give it a try and taste your beer and see how your brews change, how your fermentation changes. I'm sure it'll be for the better. None. Beer time. Cool.
What do farts smell like? Are they like chunky or do you seem to know what
I do. Chunky. Yeah, it sticks in the back of your throat. Mouthfeel. No, now I'm all red. Cool. Yeah. It's the heat of this lamp. Cool. Thanks, guys.